In my last video, I talked about the variable ND filter and how to use this to kind of get a blurry background. Today what I want to do is show you a comparison between using a variable ND filter versus high-speed sync. And I'm just going to be using the Godox TT350, a flash that I highly recommend, along with the X1T trigger. Now, high-speed sync is definitely a legitimate technique that you should have in your photography skill set, but it does have a few caveats. Generally speaking, when you're using high-speed sync, your flash output power is greatly reduced. It also drains your battery, and it also shortens the life of the flash unit itself. So using high-speed sync, it's very handy, when you're indoors, you want to shoot high-speed action, or when you're outdoors and you really want to shoot in very bright sunlight and crush all of that ambient light. But the problem is you need a very powerful flash. But if you have a variable ND filter, you can get away in broad daylight with the Godox TT350, which is a little 2-battery flash, and still get that nice blurry background and very good lighting. So let me go ahead and demonstrate. First, I'm just going to do just a quick ambient shot, and then I'm going to do a high-speed sync shot, and then I'm going to do one with the variable ND filter, and then you'll see the difference in terms of the exposure. It's pretty dramatic. So let me show you my basic setup here. I have the Olympus EM10 Mark II together with the X1T trigger, and then I have the same 45mm f1.8 lens, and then just ignore the rest of this gear here, is just for the sake of making this video. And let me show you my light setup. Alright, for my light setup, I just have this light stand, the Godox TT350, and an umbrella. Very simple setup. Again, the first shot will be an ambient light shot. I'm in aperture priority at f1.8, and as you can see, my shutter speed at ISO 200 is at 1/4000th of a second. So you can tell, it's a very bright scene. Now when I walk into the frame, the shutter speed will probably drop a little, but let's go ahead and get the shot. So as you can see, I'm very underexposed, and what I would do in this situation is dial in a little positive exposure compensation. So I'm thinking probably 1, maybe 2 stops. So let's see what happens when I do that. Let's try 1 2/3 stop. And as you can see, the shutter speed has dropped down to 1/1600. So let's get another shot there. So as you can see in this shot, I'm properly exposed now, but the highlights are blown out and everything in the background is just too bright, and it's really not a very good picture. So let's try something with high-speed sync using the light setup I showed you earlier. So all I have to do is turn on the trigger. Then just turning on the trigger, you'll notice the shutter speed dropped to 1/180th of a second. So I need to turn on the high-speed sync. So we'll do that. And now you can see that we're back up to 1/1600. And then let me dial the exposure compensation back down to 0. And now we're blinking 1/4000th of a second. So the camera's telling me that it's not going to be able to achieve the proper exposure because it cannot go over 1/4000th of a second, hence making the picture too bright. So what I need to do is, I always like to try and lower the ISO first. And we're in auto ISO at 200. So I think, what I can do is put it in low. And there, now we're at 1/2000th of a second. So now we're within the limits of the camera. Let's give this a shot. Alright, so the camera did a very good job. I had the flash in TTL mode, and it properly exposed me, and it brought the background, the ambient levels, down to about what I can see with my naked eye. But the highlights are still blown out. So the next thing I'll try is, I want to bring the highlights back in via high-speed sync. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a negative exposure comp. Let's try -1. But now the problem is my shutter speed is bumped up to 1/4000th again. So what I can do is probably just raise the aperture a little bit. and that gets me right there at 1/4000th of a second. Now the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a +1 exposure compensation on the flash, because we've lowered the overall exposure by 1 stop, so I'll need to increase the exposure or power on the flash by 1 stop. Alright, let's take a shot there. So as you can see, this picture is fairly well exposed. The highlights aren't blown anymore, but the flash really kind of ran out of power to illuminate me properly, because I'm still slightly underexposed. You can still see all of the different shadows, you know, on my shirt. So I'm going to show you how to do this using the variable ND filter and what kind of results we get. I've attached the variable ND filter to the camera here, and there are min and max markers on here, and I've just dialed in about 50% or halfway between the two. And you can already see the settings on the camera have changed quite a bit. We're down to 1/320th of a second, f2, with the -1 exposure comp. So I'm going to leave that there. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off high-speed sync. So I do that simply by just flicking the switch on the X1T trigger, and now you can see the shutter speed has dropped down to 1/80th of a second. So now we're outside of the capabilities of the camera because the sync speed has dropped to 1/180th of a second. So what I have to do is, first thing I like to do is I like to just dial in on the ND filter a little bit more until I get under 1/80th, until it stops blinking. Right about there looks good. And I'll just leave it at f2. That's a pretty good aperture, pretty much wide open. And we're still in ISO low, so let's get a shot here. And let me check the flash settings. The flash is in still TTL mode with a +1 exposure comp, and again the camera's at -1. And yeah, I think that's much better. You can see that the flash definitely overpowered all of the ambient light, so I don't have those weird shadows on me anymore. And it crushed the ambient light in the background via the -1 exposure comp in the camera. So by dialing in a +1 on the trigger, I was able to bring the exposure of the subject, myself, back to a normal range. So as you can see, the variable ND filter is a very powerful tool to have in your bag, and it's not just for like crushing the ambient light so you can open up the aperture and getting that blurry background, but people use it for like you know, those smooth waterfall effects, long exposure photography, and a number of other things that I'll get into future videos.